December 1944. The Ardennes forest. Silent, snowbound, and waiting. What began as Europe's quiet winter suddenly erupted into one of the most desperate battles of the Second World War. The ground shook beneath the thunder of artillery. The white hills burned red, and across the frozen Belgian countryside, a name began to echo through the chaos. Bastogne. This was supposed to be a quiet sector, a place for rest and refit. The men of the 101st Airborne Division, weary from months of fighting in Holland, had been pulled back to France. They expected hot meals and clean clothes, not another battle. But on December 16th, the German army launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, a surprise offensive designed to split the Allied front in two. Panzer divisions rolled out of the mist, spearheading a massive assault through the dense Ardennes, targeting thinly held American lines. The quiet winter turned into hell overnight. By the time the 101st received orders to move, confusion ruled the front. Convoys of retreating American units jammed every road heading west. Snow fell in thick, heavy curtains as trucks of paratroopers pushed in the opposite direction, into the fight. Their destination was Bastogne, a small Belgian market town with 7 roads converging in all directions. It was more than just a dot on the map. It was the key to the Ardennes. If the Germans took Bastogne, they could drive straight to the Meuse River and beyond, threatening Antwerp and cutting off entire Allied armies. The paratroopers arrived in chaos. Bitter winds sliced through their uniforms. Most lacked winter gear, many without gloves, some even without helmets. Ammunition was scarce, fuel low, food limited. The 101st Airborne, reinforced by remnants of the 10th Armored Division and a scattering of artillery units, began digging in around the perimeter. Foxholes frozen solid, ground hard as iron. Every inch had to be carved by hand or bayonet. Within hours, German tanks were already probing the outskirts. Then came the encirclement. By December 20th, Bastogne was completely surrounded. German forces had sealed the town on all sides, panzers, artillery, and infantry pressing from every direction. The roads were gone, supply lines cut. The skies too overcast for Allied planes to drop aid. Inside the pocket were roughly 11,000 Americans facing nearly 60,000 Germans, equipped with tanks, mortars, and superior firepower. But morale did not collapse. Within that frozen ring of steel, discipline and defiance took hold. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, issued calm, direct orders: hold Bastogne at all costs. His headquarters were set up in the town's battered seminary, where maps were spread on makeshift tables lit by flickering candles. Outside, paratroopers and tank destroyer crews fought to contain each German thrust, losing ground, then clawing it back, often in hand-to-hand combat. The conditions were merciless. Temperatures plunged below zero. Wounded men froze where they fell, if not pulled to safety, within minutes. Medical units ran out of bandages and morphine, improvising with torn clothing and snow for ice packs. The 101st supply depots were almost empty, but soldiers shared their last rations, melting snow for water. Yet amid the suffering, something remarkable happened. Unity. Officers, engineers, cooks, medics, everyone became riflemen. They manned roadblocks, set ambushes, repaired guns, and rotated shifts in the trenches. The men held their ground not because they expected relief, but because surrender was unthinkable. Bastogne was no longer just a town. It was a symbol, a single, defiant heartbeat in the middle of the German offensive. While the enemy advanced elsewhere, this small pocket of resistance refused to yield. The longer they held, the more time they bought for the Allies to reorganize, to strike back, to turn the tide of the entire war. The snow kept falling, the artillery never stopped, and through it all, the men of the 101st Airborne dug deeper, colder, hungrier, but still alive. The siege had begun. By December 21st, the siege of Bastogne had tightened like a noose. The German ring was complete. No way in, no way out. Snow covered wrecked vehicles and frozen corpses alike. Every road leading out of town was under enemy observation. Inside the perimeter, the men of the 101st Airborne and the attached units huddled in foxholes carved into ice, their rifles stiff with frost, their breath freezing in the air. Supplies were almost gone. Ammunition was rationed, 1 bandolier per man in some units. Rations were worse. Cold sea rations split between foxholes, melted snow for water. No fires allowed for warmth or cooking because smoke drew artillery. Fuel was nearly exhausted. The few Sherman tanks left had to stay hidden to avoid wasting what little gasoline remained. Even medical supplies were gone. Medics worked in the basement of a shattered convent, using parachute silk for bandages, brandy for antiseptic, and candlelight to perform amputations. The men had no winter clothing. Their jump jackets, soaked from snow, froze stiff overnight. Frostbite became as deadly as bullets. Fingers blackened, toes turned white. The wounded who couldn't move themselves often froze before dawn. Yet, through the misery, the line never broke. The Germans attacked in waves. Artillery barrages thundered day and night. Mortar shells crashed into the foxholes, trees shattered into splinters, and panzer units probed the outer villages again and again. Each time, the paratroopers threw them back, not through numbers or equipment, but sheer will. Machine guns dug into snowbanks cut down German infantry at close range. Anti-tank teams waited motionless until the enemy tanks rolled within 50 yards before firing their last shells. In the town itself, chaos ruled. Civilians hid in basements. Buildings burned to shells. The air stank of cordite and smoke. German leaflets dropped by the hundreds, demanding surrender, promising humane treatment. None were answered. Then came the message that would define Bastogne forever. On December 22nd, under a temporary ceasefire, 2 German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried a written demand from the German commander, General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz. The letter was direct. Bastogne was surrounded, resistance was hopeless, and the Americans were to surrender to avoid further bloodshed. When the note reached Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, he read it aloud, paused, and muttered a single word: nuts. That one word became the entire reply, typed, signed, and delivered back to the Germans. No explanation, no bravado, just contempt. The message spread like wildfire through every unit. In the frozen trenches and dark basements of Bastogne, soldiers laughed, shouted, and loaded their weapons again. The word nuts became their battle cry. For the Germans, it was defiance they couldn't understand. For the 101st, it was the proof that surrender was not an option. But defiance couldn't stop hunger or cold. Each day, the perimeter shrank slightly under pressure. Outposts were overrun, lines bent, new foxholes dug behind the old. Paratroopers scavenged captured German rations and weapons. A single air-dropped resupply was attempted, but bad weather scattered most of the containers beyond reach. Inside Bastogne, hope began to fade, but resolve hardened. Still, word filtered in by radio intercept. Patton was coming. Somewhere to the south, in the blizzard and chaos, the U.S. Third Army was turning north. It was a whisper at first, then a promise, if they could just hold long enough. Through the 23rd and 24th, the Germans threw everything they had. Tanks broke into the outskirts. Buildings collapsed under shell fire. The defenders fought from room to room, refusing to fall back. The town's church, now a field hospital, overflowed with the wounded, their prayers drowned out by the guns outside. By Christmas Eve, the siege had reached its peak. The men of the 101st Airborne huddled in the dark, cold beyond description, eating their last rations of frozen meat and stale crackers. Outside, the horizon glowed with the flash of artillery. It was Christmas in Bastogne, surrounded, starving, frozen, yet still holding. And as the shells fell, a few soldiers sang softly in the dark, not for victory, but for survival. Bastogne still stood. By Christmas morning, 1944, Bastogne was a frozen graveyard. Snow lay thick over destroyed tanks, burned-out trucks, and bodies half buried in white drifts. The Germans had thrown everything they had at the perimeter: tanks, artillery, infantry, but the 101st Airborne still held. The siege had lasted a week, and every hour had been paid for in blood and frostbite. Inside the town, soldiers barely recognized one another. Eyes sunken, faces blackened with soot, hands wrapped in rags. There was no warmth, no food, and almost no ammunition left. Foxholes filled with ice water. Men slept sitting up, rifles across their knees. The town's aid stations were overflowing. The medics worked non-stop, amputating limbs, patching wounds, whispering prayers they barely believed in. The Germans, frustrated by the Americans' refusal to surrender, decided to crush Bastogne once and for all. On Christmas Day, at dawn, they launched their heaviest assault yet. Panzer columns of the 15th Panzer Grenadier and 26th Volksgrenadier divisions, supported by artillery and mortars, stormed the southern edge of town near Marvy and Neff. The bombardment lasted hours. The ground shook as shells tore through the snow, shredding trees and smashing foxholes. When the tanks advanced, the paratroopers were waiting. Hidden in ditches, foxholes, and shattered houses, the men of the 501st and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments unleashed everything they had left: bazookas, machine guns, rifles, even captured German Panzerfausts. American artillery, firing from within Bastogne itself, hit targets at point-blank range. The air filled with smoke, snow, and screams. The fighting became savage and close. German tanks broke into the outskirts of Marvy, rolling over foxholes, firing point-blank into basements. Paratroopers counterattacked in small squads, using grenades and bazookas in deadly ambushes. For every position lost, another was retaken. By nightfall, the attack was broken. The German offensive had failed. Bastogne, still surrounded, still starving, had survived its worst day. But survival came at a price. Hundreds were dead or wounded. The 101st's lines were paper-thin. Ammunition had run dangerously low. Medical supplies were nearly gone, and the men had gone 2 days without sleep. In the command post beneath the seminary, General McAuliffe listened to the reports with a blank face. His only order: hold. Then, at last, the sound they had prayed for. The distant rumble of engines, not German, but American. To the south, in the deep snow near Arlon, General George S. Patton's Third Army had turned north in one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war. In less than 3 days, Patton had pivoted an entire army 90 degrees and driven it toward Bastogne through blizzards, wrecked roads, and German ambushes. His men of the 4th Armored Division were exhausted, their tanks half frozen, but they pushed relentlessly forward. By December 26th, they were close enough to hear the guns of Bastogne. The last stretch, near the village of Arsenois, was the most dangerous. German anti-tank guns and machine guns lined the roads. The 37th Tank Battalion fought through one ambush after another, losing men and vehicles every mile. At 4:50 p.m., a tank commanded by Lieutenant Charles Bogus broke through the final German line and rolled into Bastogne. When the paratroopers saw the white star of Patton's armor coming through the snow, cheers and gunfire filled the air. Men who hadn't eaten in days laughed, cried, and waved. Some could barely stand. The siege was broken. Bastogne was free. But relief did not mean rest. The Germans still held strong positions all around, and the 101st Airborne had to keep fighting to expand the corridor. Casualties were heavy, frostbite cases climbed, and air evacuations were slow. Even as trucks of supplies and medics poured in, the soldiers who had held the line were too numb to celebrate. They had fought for survival so long that victory barely registered. When Patton's staff radioed headquarters that Bastogne had been relieved, the message was simple: Bastogne entered. No triumphal words, just a fact carved into history. The 101st had not been rescued in the traditional sense. They had held until help arrived. Against impossible odds, surrounded, starving, and freezing, they had done what they were ordered to do. They never surrendered, and they never broke. The cost was staggering. More than 2,000 American casualties, countless frostbite victims, and a landscape littered with the wreckage of war. But their stand had done more than hold a town. It had broken the momentum of the entire German offensive. Bastogne had become the anvil upon which Hitler's last gamble shattered. The men of the 101st didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were tired, hungry, and haunted by what they had seen. But history would remember them differently. The siege of Bastogne became a symbol of American endurance, of ordinary men who refused to yield when surrounded by darkness and death. The relief of Bastogne was not the end of the Battle of the Bulge, but it was the turning point. The Germans would never again seize the initiative in the West. The tide of the war had turned, and it turned in the snow, around a small Belgian town that refused to die. When the siege of Bastogne finally ended, the men who had held the line were barely alive. Their faces were gaunt, their hands frost-bitten, their eyes hollow from exhaustion. What had been a fighting division was now a collection of survivors, men who had endured hunger, cold, and constant shell fire for nearly 2 weeks. The relief brought no comfort. The town was a wasteland, buildings reduced to rubble, trees shredded by artillery, the air still thick with the stench of burned vehicles and bodies. In the makeshift hospitals, hundreds of wounded lay wrapped in blankets, waiting for evacuation. Many had lost fingers, toes, or limbs to frostbite. Others were so weak they couldn't stand. The medics worked without rest, their supplies finally replenished, but their strength nearly gone. Snow kept falling as supply convoys rolled in, carrying food, blankets, and ammunition. The men ate slowly. Their stomachs shrunk from starvation. Some couldn't keep the food down. Others simply stared into space, their minds still locked in the foxholes they had survived. In every face was the same mix of disbelief and fatigue. They had done the impossible, but it had cost more than they could grasp. Orders came quickly: hold the sector, reorganize, prepare for counteroffensives. There was no time to rest or reflect. The 101st Airborne stayed in the Bastogne area for weeks, pushing back lingering German forces, clearing villages, and strengthening positions. The same men who had fought without supplies now had to fight again, this time to secure what they had defended. Mail caught up to them slowly. Letters from home, Christmas packages that had never arrived, words of pride and love that now felt distant. Many soldiers couldn't bring themselves to write back. There were no words for what Bastogne had been, no way to describe the cold, the fear, or the bond that had kept them alive. When finally rotated out of the front lines, they moved through towns filled with civilians cheering, waving flags, calling them heroes. But the men of Bastogne didn't cheer back. They were proud, yes, but quiet. They had seen too much, lost too many. In the weeks that followed, the wounded were sent home or to hospitals in France. Many never returned to combat. The frostbite cases alone numbered in the thousands. Others carried invisible wounds, nightmares, tremors, and the silence that followed them for years. The war in Europe raged on, but Bastogne had marked them permanently. It was no longer just a battle on a map. It was a memory carved into bone. For some, it was the proudest moment of their lives. For others, it was the darkest. Most spoke little of it after the war. When asked what they did in Bastogne, many simply said, "We held." In time, medals were awarded. General McAuliffe was promoted. The 101st Airborne received the Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism. But the real measure of their victory was quieter. In the faces of the men who came home alive, and in the graves of those who did not. The frozen town they defended would never forget them. Bastogne rebuilt itself, brick by brick, around the memory of that winter. Today, memorials mark the ground where they stood, silent, cold, and enduring, just like the men who fought there. They had entered Bastogne as soldiers. They left as legends, not for what they conquered, but for what they refused to give up. The siege of Bastogne ended long ago, but its echo never faded. What the 101st Airborne achieved in that frozen Belgian town became one of the defining moments of the Second World War, not because of territory gained, but because of spirit revealed. Those who fought there proved that courage is not measured in victories or medals, but in endurance, the ability to keep standing when surrounded, outnumbered, and forgotten. Bastogne showed the world what ordinary men could do when pushed beyond all limits. They didn't fight for glory. They fought because they refused to surrender, because their brothers beside them refused. The battle became a symbol of American resolve. In the darkest winter of the war, when the enemy believed they could shatter Allied morale, Bastogne stood unbroken. That defiance, the single word nuts, came to represent the heart of the Allied fight. Stubborn, fearless, unyielding. After the war, many of those men returned home quietly. They built families, worked ordinary jobs, and rarely spoke of the cold or the blood. But in military academies, in history books, and in the hearts of every soldier who studied their stand, Bastogne remained sacred ground. The lessons they taught, teamwork, endurance, and faith in one another, became the foundation of modern combat leadership. To this day, the people of Bastogne honor the men of the 101st. Every winter, candles burn in the windows to remember the Americans who defended their town. Veterans who return there are greeted not as visitors, but as brothers. And on the ground where the division once stood, the Mardesan Memorial rises, each star and stone etched with the names of the states that sent their sons to fight. The siege of Bastogne is more than history. It's a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest moments, courage can light the way. That leadership is not about orders, but about standing firm when others fall. And that true strength is found not in numbers, but in unity. The men of the 101st Airborne didn't just hold Bastogne. They held the line for all who would come after. Their stand turned the tide of the war, and their defiance became immortal. If you were moved by this story of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood, hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe to WWII Heroes Legends. Because here, the courage of the past still speaks, and the heroes of history never fade.